Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Zombie deer, the impact of chronic wasting disease, presented by wildlife biologist and NatHab expedition leader Aaron Bott. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. Howdy, everyone. Hopefully you're enjoying yourselves as we approach the holidays. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about an issue that is really important, chronic wasting disease. If you're not familiar with its official name, perhaps you've heard sensationally this disease described throughout the news nationally, internationally as the zombie apocalypse that's affecting our deer populations. This is a really important subject. I'm excited to talk to you about it, to educate you a little bit about what this disease is, how it's spreading, and what we need to be doing as a country, as countries internationally to help prevent the spread of this disease as much as possible. I am going to say right up front that this topic today deals with sick animals, and there are some slides here that might be a little bit macabre for some people, so viewer discretion advised. There's nothing really graphic, but there are some pictures here of dead animals, dead deer, and sick deer as well. Again, nothing very graphic, but if you are sensitive to that, please be aware. I also, though, don't want to deter anyone from turning off, because this is a very important subject that a lot of people don't know about, they don't know a lot about, and it's something that we all need to be concerned about. So a little bit of a background of myself. I'm a wildlife biologist. I have lived in the Intermountain American West for 7 generations. My family's been out here since the 1850s. I'm very much a Western boy at heart. I grew up living in the mountains, working in the mountains just outside of Yellowstone National Park. I work with federal and state wildlife agencies, researching and studying particularly large carnivores. I specialize in wolves, but I also deal a lot with grizzly bears, mule deer, elk, moose, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, black bears, cougars, pretty much the whole suite of North American megafauna. So I get a lot of hands-on opportunities to research animals, to study animals, to manage and to conserve and protect wildlife as well. I'm again talking to you today about deer, or the deer family at large, and a disease that is affecting them. This is something that we as wildlife biologists are monitoring very closely, because it's a contagious disease that's spreading across North America and actually is now jumping ponds. Now it's over in Europe as well as Asia. So chronic wasting disease, or this zombie deer disease that is capturing so many headlines. What is it? Well, let's go back to the beginning. First off, chronic wasting disease is a member of the TSE family group of diseases. This TSE group stands for Transmissible Spongiform Encephalopathy. These words can be broken down pretty easily. Transmissible is infectious. It's transmitted between different species or between different individuals. The spongiform reflects the state of the brain or the central nervous system after the disease reaches an advanced stage. And we're also referring again to the brain here for our research. So really quickly, the TSE we're talking about here is describing different types of diseases that are progressive, they're aggressive, they are, once they're infecting an individual or an animal or a human, they're unstoppable, unfortunately. Invariably, they're fatal, and they cause neurological degeneration. They're associated with prions, which are a protein that affect the brain and the nervous system. So there are several different kinds of TSEs. Some of them I'm sure you're familiar with. But what makes these types of diseases very unique is that they're not caused by a virus, and they're not caused by a bacteria or a fungus. They're actually caused by a protein. This complicates everything because the prion, the protein, lacks a nucleic acid, which means that they can't be broken down by radiation, and they're, in this case, extremely resistant to any kind of chemical or environmental degradation. And as a protein, the body does not recognize it as something that is foreign, and so there's not really an immune defense to fighting this disease off once an animal or an individual becomes infected. So all mammals produce proteins that we then later term as prions. So these proteins are chains of amino acids that fold into three-dimensional shapes. They help in cellular communication, and generally these prions have a half-life of 4 to 6 hours. So your body is constantly creating these proteins, and then they're recycling them back into your body. This is happening constantly. Now, TSE is caused by a prion that has misfolded or mutated. We don't completely understand why this happens. In some cases, and I'll talk about this in a second, it can be as horrifying as spontaneity. It's happening without any apparent reason to us. And in other cases, prions are infecting or transmitting their malicious form onto other prions or proteins. So a prion that is misfolded or a disease protein becomes infectious. It's really contagious. And unlike a healthy prion, it does not break down. It does not become recycled back into the body. In fact, if an individual or an animal is infected and diagnosed with a TSE, then these prions are congregating inside that individual's body, and they become concentrated in typically the central nervous system, in the organs, and even in parts of the muscles of the infected individual. And throughout the individual's life, it will then shed these infectious prions into the environment. So again, this is a scary disease or a family of diseases because it's not a bacteria, it's not a virus, it's a protein. The abnormal folding of the prion leads to neurological degeneration, resulting in ultimately loss of motor skills. Again, the spongiform in the TSE is referring to the spongy appearance that the brain or the central nervous system or the cerebral material eventually looks like after it has become infected with this TSE. So this slide here on the left, this image that you can see is a cross-section of a brain, and all those cavities, all those holes are left over by the prions that are really breaking apart the brain. It's not visible to the naked eye, but under a microscope, you can see that there is degeneration taking place of the brain. Again, with all TSEs, this terrible and horrific family of diseases, there is no treatment, not for any of them, and the disease is always fatal, again, which makes this a very morbid subject. We don't have any medications, any vaccines. We don't have any way to treat this. If an individual human or an individual animal is infected with a TSE, the animal will die. Now, the most popular form of TSE, transmissible spongiform, is the bovid or the bovine group, also popularly known as mad cow disease. Particularly in the 1990s, mad cow disease made headlines internationally. There was a large outbreak in Europe, in Great Britain specifically, where probably 1 million or more cattle were infected with this terrible TSE, this terrible spongiform disease. These animals became infected in a very interesting way. Again, these prions are very contagious, and most likely what was happening is cattle had been fed bits and pieces called offal, or the remains of other cows that had been left over from slaughter. So cattle, in order to beef up the industry, in order to beef up the production, protein is necessary to help all animals typically herbivores get that protein from nitrogen or from the grasses and the vegetation that they eat. In order to spike the diet, we were recycling offal, the leftovers or the remains of other cattle, and putting it into their feed, and in doing so we were infecting cattle. This was really alarming because we suddenly started seeing cattle getting sick and dying, and as many of you know, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, mad cow disease spilled over. It did not just infect cattle, but it also infected some humans, a very small portion of humans compared to how much meat was distributed internationally. But it's alarming because it can carry over from one species to another. How did the first cow get mad cow disease? There's a lot of speculation there, but it probably jumped from a different TSE known as scrapie, excuse me. Scrapie is a TSE that we've known about for hundreds of years, actually. We've known about it longer than any other kind of TSE. We didn't understand exactly what it was to the fullest extent, but we have for centuries recognized the degenerative process taking place in afflicted sheep. They start to wear away, they become emaciated, and they ultimately die. It's called scrapie because allegedly the sick animal or individual would go up and lean against posts or trees and just scrape themselves back and forth, back and forth. And although we've known about this disease for a very long time, it's actually pretty new here in North America. Again, that oceanic divide prevented it from coming over to North America until I think the 1940s. But once it did, we've seen populations of sheep in North America become infected, again, because this TSE is so contagious. Again, speculation, we're not sure, but it's possible that this disease leapt or spilled over from the sheep into a cow or cattle, and then again that institutionalized cannibalism that was practiced ultimately contaminated 1 million plus cows, and horrifically then that was spread to humans. As soon as we as humanity recognized what was happening, and we recognized that it was being caused by augmenting the diet of cattle with offal with the protein remains of other slaughtered cattle, that was banned, and that practice has been brought to a halt, which fortunately brought that exponential curve of the disease from spreading back down, and now it's a pretty rare occurrence. We still see it here and there, but it's not like it was back in the 90s. Another TSE is the CREUTZFELDT-JAKOB disease, which is the human form of a TSE. Again, this is alarming because we're talking about people here, but the Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is a spontaneous reaction rather than an oral enhanced or an aerosol enhanced transmission of the disease. So we're not completely sure how this disease works. It's extremely rare, but not as rare as we would like. Generally, it's 1 to 1.5 million people globally are infected or diagnosed with this disease. It seems to be spontaneous, at least as far as we can tell. It's not being transmitted laterally. It's not being passed from one person to another, but ultimately there's some type of genotypic mutation, and the protein goes aberrant, it goes rogue, and it ultimately destroys the person's central nervous system. There is such a thing as a variant of this specific disease, the variant being variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is spread from one species to another and is a result of the consuming of infected cattle or infected bovine. So during the 1990s, again, when we had that large threat of mad cow disease on the rise, spreading, there were, I think it was something like 200 people who were diagnosed with this variant disease of TSE, and they had gotten it, they contracted this disease by consuming infected meat. Almost 1 million different cattle had been slaughtered and shipped worldwide, and yet 200 people contracted this disease. So the risk rate is very low of anyone contracting this. There are barriers, molecular barriers from this TSE being transmitted from one species to another, but that risk is not zero, and unfortunately people were diagnosed with this variant disease of TSE, and ultimately they died. Another human variation of this disease is known as KURU, and it was first documented in the 1920s or 1930s in New Guinea, where a group of people practiced ritualized cannibalism. And again, we're not exactly sure how the first case happened, what kind of spontaneous mutation took place in these proteins, but ultimately this ritualized cannibalism spread this KURU, this specific type of TSE, to individuals of the tribe, and it wasn't until the government stepped down and researchers began to realize what was happening that finally we were able to stop that disease from spreading any further. And TSEs are also found in several other forms of species or genuses. Mink is another one, but today we're talking specifically about chronic wasting disease. So hopefully I gave you a little bit of a background without losing you, but it's important to recognize that TSE is a family of diseases caused by a protein, an aberrant protein called a prion, which ultimately causes neurological degradation or destruction. So the brain starts to rot, more or less. It starts to fall apart, and the animal loses control of itself, its motor skills, its memory, and ultimately it does die. It's, again, 100% fatal. There's no coming back once you're infected with it. Chronic wasting disease is the most alarming, perhaps, in North America of these diseases. The Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the KURU, the bovine, scrapie, all of those variations of this disease are less common than chronic wasting disease. So today we're going to talk about chronic wasting disease and what it means to deer across the continent and across the planet, actually. One more thing I want to tell you before we get in any further is I'd like to define what a cervid is. So a cervid is a mammal of the deer family. So you might hear me say cervid or cervidae or cervidae multiple times throughout this presentation, and whenever I say cervid, I'm referring to deer at large. When I talk about chronic wasting disease, I might often resort to using the acronym CWD, which is most common, so CWD. Members of the cervid family include white-tailed deer, and these species are specific to North America, and these are species that are infected or have been known to be receptive to chronic wasting disease. So white-tailed deer being the most prevalent because they are the most abundant species of deer that we have in North America. Mule deer in the American West, they are susceptible. Elk or wapiti, moose, and most recently we have documented caribou, otherwise known as reindeer in some parts of the world, as having contracted chronic wasting disease or CWD. Again, because of prevalence and the ecology and behavior of these different species, the seroprevalence of the disease is different depending on the species. It's highest again in areas of the Midwest with white-tailed deer, in mule deer populations throughout the American West. The prevalence of the disease is growing. There's some genotypic resistance for the disease to spread to elk, so we see less CWD in elk than we do in deer, specifically white-tailed deer and mule deer, but we do catch CWD in elk. So for example, in this state where I'm going out in this next week, and we're going to be taking biopsies from deer and from elk to determine the seroprevalence of 2020's CWD prevalence in this region. We don't expect to see a lot of cases of CWD in elk, more so in our mule deer population. Moose, they are solitary creatures, and so we don't see a lot of moose contracting CWD. It happens. We've had a handful of cases all across the country. Again, it's more of a behavior thing. This is an infectious, a contagious disease, and because moose don't congregate in large herds, and perhaps they have some genotypic barriers as well, the prevalence in moose is much lower. Caribou, we're just learning about. We'll see what or how rapid the disease spreads among caribou. We're concerned about caribou because, like elk and deer, they congregate in large herds where the disease can be transmitted very quickly. Just so you're aware, CWD is being taken very seriously. It's one of the world's most alarming wildlife crises. People, I think, don't really understand what it is, and my objective today is to help explain more about it and answer some of your questions. Some of it is a little bit depressing, but it's important that we recognize what is happening so that we can start to be proactive in protecting our natural resources, these wildlife populations. A little bit about the origin. The origin of CWD is unknown. It was first identified in 1967 at a wildlife research facility in Colorado in a mule deer. It was identified and people were kind of shocked. They'd never seen a TSE form in the deer family ever before. How did it get there? Well, it's been hypothesized but not proven that CWD could be a spillover from scrappy infected sheep, just kind of like there's that hypothesis that the TSE spilled over from sheep to cattle. Again, this is just speculation. We don't really know. It's also possible that CWD is a spontaneous disease, that all it took was one individual with a mutation, and it was first again documented in 1967. Some critics of the disease say that it's probably been around forever, but all scientific communities that I'm aware of refute that, saying that if it was, there's no biological retardant that would stop this disease from spreading that we know of. And so if it's been around for a long time, we would have seen it for decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years. So it's pretty well confirmed that by most scientific communities that this is a new phenomenon. The organs affected by chronic wasting disease, again, it's a degeneration of the central nervous system, which attacks the brain, causing pores or holes to open up in the brain, affecting the movements and the behaviors of the animal. The highest concentrations of these prions are found in the lymph nodes, in the spleen, the brain, the eyes, and the spinal cord. Although the prions can be found also in the muscles of the animal, it's that, again, central nervous system that has the highest concentration of these prions, the highest course of infected agents. So the transmission of CWD is lateral. It spreads from animal to animal rather than horizontal. So we're not really seeing an infected female giving birth to an infected fawn or calf in this case. It's spreading from one individual that's coming across another individual. There's a lot of parallels, I think, since most of us are now more pandemic savvy than we ever were before, thanks to 2020. We recognize that COVID-19 is also spread laterally. So it's from one individual infecting another individual. So that's the same thing with chronic wasting disease. The most common ways that the disease prions are shed is through feces, urine, saliva, and of course decomposing carcasses. So when an animal dies, then its body, its prions, are then leached into the soil. Otherwise, the animal is spreading the disease through urination, through defecation, and through saliva. Now, this is one of the most alarming things about chronic wasting disease, is its resilience to, again, the environment and to chemical degradation. So once an animal is urinating or excretes waste into the environment, the prions can persist in the environment for years or even decades. which is pretty terrifying. Again, with COVID-19, I think all of us are somewhat familiar with the system of ecology with that disease, but basically, if someone sneezes who has had COVID-19, and I'm not a doctor regarding COVID-19, but generally if they are infected and they sneeze on a tabletop after the course of a few weeks or a few days, again, I don't know the details, then the virus breaks down. But with these prions, the prions persist in the environment. So if an infected deer urinates on a plant, then that plant or that soil is going to remain infected for years or even decades, which can lead to the causation and the infecting of other animals that come into that area and eat the grass that one deer urinated on years ago, as long as those prions remain in the soil. So prions are capable of binding to certain plants, which is also alarming, and binding to certain soils like clay, and they can be transported while still potentially remaining infectious. So if you had a deer that urinated on a certain plant and then you picked up that plant and moved it, then you could be transmitting the disease. So the fact that the disease does not go away with time is pretty alarming. This very morbid picture is taken of the 2002 CWD cleansing efforts taking place up in Wisconsin, where a large population of white-tailed deer were found infected with CWD. The state tried to be proactive and extirpate the disease by culling a large herd and then incinerating the animals. So CWD prions are extremely resistant to chemical or environmental degradation. So infectious agents can actually remain in the landscape for years, and high concentrations of disinfectants such as heat, radiation, and formaldehyde are practically useless. So any disinfectants that we might use in a clinical facility where this disease has been found, or in the environment where this has been found, chlorine, etc., bleach, it doesn't have any effect on the prion, which is very alarming. In order to remove a body that has been infected appropriately, then we incinerate it. And generally we have to reach temperatures of 600 degrees Celsius or higher. So you're looking at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in order to burn out these prions. So if you have an animal that is infected and then you tried to cook the prions out of the meat, you're not gonna do it. You need to be incinerating the remains of that animal at very high temperatures, very extreme temperatures, before you're gonna start to break down those prions. This is a map currently showing where CWD has been found as of 2020. CWD has been noted in free-ranging or wild populations of cervids, as well as captive populations or game farms. You can see that it's slowly been spreading out both east and west. Again, it was first recognized in Colorado, and now it's been transmitted, radiating out to other states and even provinces. There are some states and provinces where CWD has only been found in captive cervid herds or game farms. And then there are states where it's probable that CWD is already prevalent, but we haven't had any documented cases yet. So I look at states like Idaho, or I look at Kentucky, where they've got a lot of positive cases surrounding them. I would suspect that those states do have CWD, although it hasn't yet been documented. So how does CWD spread? We obviously know that it's contagious and that it can spread from one animal to another animal through feces, saliva, urine. But also, it's not just the natural migration of these species that is spreading this disease quickly. It's also being the spread of the disease is being contributed to human-aided support or transportation of captive and wild animals, which is greatly exacerbating the risk and the spread of CWD among populations across the country and even across the world. So it is legal in a lot of states to have to have populations of captive cervids. So you have deer farms and you have elk farms, for example. These, I think, people don't really recognize are utilized for meat. So It's illegal in North America, in the United States, to sell any meat that you harvest as a hunter. So if you are a person who has ever gone to a store or to a restaurant and you've ordered an elk burger or a buffalo burger or a venison steak, those have not been harvested from the wild. That's an illegal practice. And so if you are ordering that kind of food, you're getting it from a game farm. And in these close confined areas, it's a part of business, just like in ranching cattle and sheep, to transport animals from one location to another. And in doing so, we've recognized that we have spread chronic waste and disease to other states and other counties and even other countries where CWD was not there originally. In fact, we have CWD confirmed in South Korea that popped up there when we transported some Canadian elk over to South Korea. We've also seen very recently CWD pop up in Norway, Finland, and Sweden. It's interesting to look at those populations in Norway and Sweden and Finland because as far as we know, we didn't have any transportation of captive animals over to those countries. And so people are exploring the idea that perhaps, again, this is a spillover from scrapie, that there were some sheep in Scandinavia that were infected with a TSE, and it has spilled over into some moose and into some reindeer herds. So the Scandinavian countries are also on board with this disease, trying to figure out a solution. Now, how does CWD work? What's its cycle in the body of the animal? Well, the minimum incubation period between infection and the onset of apparent symptoms is 1.5 to 2 years. That's typically average. So you can become infected with a prion, but your body doesn't show any signs of being infected, and perhaps you might not even know that you're infected until the very advanced stages of the disease. Generally, when the animal begins to wear away and look like a zombie because it's losing its motor skills, etc., that's in the last few weeks of the animal's life, the last couple of months, that the animal really turns into that zombie. But before then, it appears healthy, but it is still spreading the disease. So in most cases, infected animals aren't showing any visible signs. They appear healthy until the very last few months of the animal's life. But during that 1.5 to 2 years, the animal is contagious and it is infecting its environment. It's spreading the disease, which is, again, pretty scary because it acts so slow. In an advanced stage, the animal loses weight, it becomes emaciated, it begins to drink and urinate excessively, but ultimately behavioral changes occur again because it's losing its brain. So it becomes listless. If an animal in your neighborhood, a deer that is behaving very weird, very oddly, it's not afraid of humans, it's drooling, you should call wildlife services immediately, have the animal investigated. Another alarming fact regarding CWD is that there is currently no conclusive way to test live animals for CWD. The most reliable way to detect the seroprevalence is through post-mortem or taking tissue samples during a necropsy. Again, something that's really frustrating about this disease is you can't just go to a herd of deer and say, okay, we're gonna tranquilize all of them and we're gonna go through and take their temperatures and we're gonna figure out which ones have CWD and which ones do not. It doesn't work like that. In order to know if the animal has CWD before it reaches that advanced stage, you have to do a post-mortem necropsy. So generally what we do in that case, if we have a diseased deer, an infected animal, is we take out the lymph nodes, which are, again, an area where there's a high concentration of those infected prions. So they're just up here in the throat area, and they're the size of little beans. You take them out and you can run laboratory tests to confirm if they have had CWD or not. We're working really hard to create more reliable, viable options of testing animals for CWD. And I'll talk about some of those options later on, but the most conclusive way to determine if an animal has had CWD is after it's dead, unfortunately. So again, how is this disease spreading globally? How is it spreading nationally? Well, the movement of animals between game farms has been identified as a key role in the continued spread of CWD. In these situations, you have infected animals that no one can see or observe as infected until it's too late. In the meantime, they are infecting their pens, they're infecting the soils. And if you were to, in this picture here that I've presented, if it was confirmed that these animals had CWD and you were to cull them and remove them, that ground is no longer sustainable for elk populations, for deer populations, because the prions are in the soil. And so if you were to wait 2 or 3 years and then bring more elk back into this area, they would start to get sick again. Something that's frustrating and alarming. So how are we going to change our behaviors? How are we going to manage populations differently? It's one thing to look at how we can manage game farms differently, but how do we also manage our wildlife populations differently? This is a famous area, the National Elk Refuge, just outside of Grand Teton National Park in Jackson Hole. If you've gone to Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park with Natural Habitat Adventures, I'm sure you were educated on the National Elk Refuge. This is a historic area where back in 1912, the federal government set aside land to protect the remaining elk in this ecosystem. Squatters and hide hunters had rained havoc on the remaining elk in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Farmers had taken the land that these animals typically would use for forage, and as the elk population dwindled and almost collapsed, a bunch of philanthropists got together, the community got together and donated land with the approval of Congress and with congressional funds to feed elk, to help save them, to do a good turn and to bring back the elk population from the brink of extinction. That National Elk Refuge system did wonders, and if it weren't for that National Elk Refuge program and the feeding program of wild animals, of wild elk, then we probably would have lost a majority of our elk, if not all of our elk, in the southern portion of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But here we are over 100 years later, and suddenly we have this novel disease creeping up on the doorstep of Yellowstone, and we are congregating wildlife in dense, unnatural densities in large groupings that are less than ideal. And just like taking one sick kid and putting him into a classroom, it doesn't take long for that disease or that sickness to spread to his classmates. And so you get one diseased animal, one sick deer here on the National Elk Refuge, where we continue to feed wildlife, where we continue to feed elk, and it won't be long before this disease spreads throughout all of the herd. In 2017, we had a mule deer, get hit by a car just outside of this National Elk Refuge. And it was just like protocol mandated. It was tested and was confirmed positive for CWD, the first CWD confirmed case in the Jackson Hole area. So we found one case with a mule deer, and if we found one, then we know that there are others out there. So it's highly likely that a lot of elk and a lot of deer in this area are infected, and it's now coming into the Yellowstone ecosystem. So again, unnatural concentrations of wildlife increase the rate of transmission. You're bringing wildlife together, they're mixing their saliva, their urine, and their feces, and you get one infected animal coming a long way, hanging out with different deer, different elk, different moose, and you're going to get the rest of them sick. This is why it is so important for people not to feed wildlife. I get it, it's fun, it's cute, and there's something about putting out seed and seeing deer come into your backyard. But if communities continually persist in feeding wildlife in our backyards, we're going to see a higher seroprevalence of CWD in our local deer populations. Right now, I have a community that persists in feeding deer in their backyards. They're urban deer, they're city deer, and people put out corn and they put out seed and grain for these animals in the backyards, even though it's illegal in a lot of places. And because of that, we have a high prevalence of CWD, and deer are dying in the streets, literally, and we're having to go and collect these animals and incinerate them, and we're trying to encourage the public to please obey the law and don't feed deer. This is one of those deer. This was a iconic melanistic deer. It had a black coat color. It was a pigmentation mutation. In any case, it was an icon of this community. Everyone loved it. They thought it was cool, and took pictures of it. It was, I think, 3 years old and fell over dead one morning in someone's backyard. We went and we tested it. We checked its lymph nodes, took him to the laboratory, and sure enough, it tested positive for CWD. And it had grown up in the neighborhoods being fed by people. And of course, too, if we expect private citizens to not feed wildlife, then we should also expect our governments to not feed wildlife. The federal governments and the state governments that have these feeding programs for elk and for deer should also desist. And I think that's the large consensus among the scientific community. Now, zoonosis or zoonotic diseases are diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans. We should all be pretty familiar with this concept by now. The most obvious one would be COVID-19, which was transmitted from a wildlife population in China to humans through bats. And in any case, zoonosis is something that we should all be concerned of. Wildlife, all species, humans and wildlife, we all have different thresholds of immunity to certain viruses and bacterias. But some of those diseases, some of those prion diseases, some of those virus diseases, bacterial diseases, they can spill over from one genus or species into another. And that is the alarm. So here we have this TSE, this chronic wasting disease, which is highly contagious among cervids, among members of the deer family. Can humans get it? Humans obviously eat a lot of deer. We hunt deer. We live off of deer. We overlap our communities with deer habitat. So can people get CWD? Can we have this horrific disease be transmitted to humans? Well, because of this horrific disease, there's obviously been a lot of research put into this investigation. So the best that we have been able to find so far is that molecular compatibility suggests that there is a significant species barrier between CWD and humans. And so CWD is not well adapted to infect humans. There has never been a documented case of a human becoming infected with CWD. But you cannot rule out the possibility that CWD is zoonotic. Again, we had 1 million different cattle go out worldwide to people that had been infected with mad cow disease, BSE, and 200 people contracted mad cow disease and ended up dying. That's a very low percentage, but it is a risk. It's like a lottery. Can we ever rule out the possibility that CWD can cross over into humans? No, we can't. Do people consume CWD positive deer all the time? Yes, they do. Do we overlap our environments and our habitat with CWD positive deer? Yes, we do. Nothing has happened so far, but we can't rule out that bizarre anomaly that could possibly happen. And that's something that we are concerned about internationally. Everyone has to determine levels of personal risk. So you have to determine, all right, this has never happened. It's very, very, very unlikely that this horrific disease will be transmitted or cross over or spill over to humans from deer. But am I willing to take that risk? Because I can't say that it won't ever happen. There's no such thing as a zero possibility. And that's what a lot of people end up having to determine their own comfort levels. Are they willing to take that risk or not? The Alliance for Public Wildlife estimates that 7,000 to 15,000 CWD infected animals are consumed annually. That number might increase by 20% each year as this disease spreads. In some areas of the United States, the prevalence of this disease are much higher than others. They can range from a 5% seroprevalence to a 50% seroprevalence. In some areas, if you're a hunter and you're going to flip a coin, the odds are 50% that you're going to harvest the CWD positive deer or elk, or 50% that you're not going to harvest the CWD positive deer or elk. At what point in time do people begin to say it's not worth hunting anymore, it's not worth consuming these animals? And that can be detrimental to our conservation system that we have here in North America, which is based on the recreational activities of consumptive use. Now, there has been a lot of speculation regarding the role of predation in disease control. And again, I mentioned earlier that I specialize in wolves. I research wolves up in Yellowstone National Park. What role do predators have on the landscape where they're capable of removing or clearing out sick animals or animals that are infected with any kind of disease, but CWD being the disease of interest here in this subject? We know that predators have been greatly reduced in distribution across North America. We have far fewer wolves than we had 200 years ago. A lot of states don't have wolves anymore, and a lot of states don't have cougars or mountain lions anymore. These are the large apex predators of North America. And some scientists hypothesize that if we had more of these predators, they would help cull sick animals out of the herds, which would at the very least slow the transmission of this disease. This is a fantastic theory, and I think, or excuse me, a fantastic hypothesis that has a lot of great implications. It has a lot of reasonable assumptions that we can make, but at this point in time, there's still hypotheses. There hasn't been any definitive scientific proof to suggest that CWD can be stopped by large predators, or at least slowed down in transmission by large predators. So wolves and cougars, again, the two apex predators that we have here in North America, they generally target weak or vulnerable prey. This is called compensatory predation. So the animal, the wolf, the cougar, they don't want to risk their own lives going after the biggest and the strongest, so they generally go for the weak or the vulnerable, that being the young or the old or the sick. And this disease, the specific TSE, chronic wasting disease, again, is genus specific, and it's not transmissible, or family specific, so it's not transmissible into predators like cougars or like wolves. So by consuming the animal, the wolf is the infected animal, the wolf is not going to become infected itself. So there is a theory, or excuse me, I keep saying theory, there is a hypothesis that by having more predators, by having more wolves on the landscape, more cougars on the landscape, we could help cleanse the herds of this disease. They would be able to target the sick animals. Now, a critique with this hypothesis is diseased animals can be shedding infectious agents for years before they exhibit any apparent signs of being sick. So yes, it might be that the wolf or the cougar can detect something that we as humans can't detect. They might be able to target on infected animals, but at what point in that infectious cycle are they able to pinpoint which animal they're going to consume, they're going to pursue, and they're going to kill? Again, it's a year and a half to 2 years, and in some cases 5 years before this animal reaches an advanced stage of chronic wasting disease and starts to wither away. But that entire time, that 1.5 to 5 years, the animal has been infected, it's constantly shedding the disease. So are the predators able to hone in and attack these infected animals early enough to help slow down the transmission? I don't know. I think that it's a very interesting subject. In Yellowstone National Park, we're looking at that. We're starting research investigating these concepts, but right now it's still a hypothesis. So we've talked a lot about chronic wasting disease, how horrifying it is and how resilient it is. What is being done? Well, as I mentioned, this week we're going out as biologists and we're capturing and we're studying wildlife. Specifically in deer, we're looking at the prevalence of CWD. We go out in helicopters and we use a net gun and we'll capture animals to put radio collars around them to understand the social dynamics of these animals as well as their migration routes. but we're also using science-based tools to determine the spread of this disease and the transmission of this disease. We're encouraging people to become educated. We're educating hunters in particular who go out and they harvest animals like deer to come in and to have their animals that have been harvested, that they have hunted, to be tested if the deer was CWD positive or not, by having biologists remove, again, those lymph nodes. We take them to the lab and we let the individual who shot the deer know if the deer was positive for CWD or not, and then we could pursue a course of action from there. Several state wildlife agencies aggressively collect and test wild deer and elk for the presence of CWD. And although I mentioned earlier that post-mortem tests are the most accurate, we can do things like rectal biopsies, where we take tissue samples of deer to try and determine whether or not they are CWD positive. These aren't always accurate, but they're better than nothing. And we're hoping to reach a point in time with scientific advancements and technological advancements where we can do live tests on deer, or even on the feces of deer, to determine whether or not an individual animal tests positive for this disease. This is a box of CWD test bags. All of these have lymph nodes in them, taken from deer harvested by hunters. State Wildlife Agency will take those again, take them to the lab, and then contact the hunter to let them know if their deer tested positive or not. This is a very invasive picture that I took of a deer having to put up with that rectal biopsy. The animal is not dead, which is better than doing a post-mortem biopsy or necropsy. But we're taking a tissue sample of the animal, and we're trying to develop better techniques for prevention, detection, and management, as well as develop a vaccine for the animals as well. We're also working really hard with the federal government and international governments to try and develop and enhance education programs that will mitigate the spread and the transmission of this disease. This is an alarming subject, and if you want to learn more about it, I encourage you to do your research and go to a valid source. Look up what the World Health Organization says about chronic wasting disease. Look up, if you're in America, look up for the Center of Disease Control. Read more about chronic wasting disease and what's being done. Become educated. If you're a hunter, please participate in going to your state wildlife agency, and if you harvest a deer or an elk, request that they test your deer or elk for CWD after you've harvested it, before you consume it. It's generally free. State wildlife agencies are willing to do that for you. That helps us at least know where the disease is at. Again, because right now, in order to be definitive in knowing where the disease is at, we have to take samples from dead animals. That really limits our knowledge of where the disease is at. I talked about how it's just recently coming into Yellowstone. We're trying to figure out what the prevalence is. Right now we think the prevalence is low, but we still have a hard time determining where it's at and what's going to happen next. So there's a lot of questions regarding chronic wasting disease that yet are to be answered. I wish that this topic ended on a happier note, but I think it's important for everyone here who stuck with me to understand that chronic wasting disease is a real problem. It's a huge problem that we have here in the United States, and it's something that we all need to be aware of and be educated on, so that we can at the very least slow the transmission, the spread of this disease, as scientists and epidemiologists work very hard to try and create a vaccine or a solution to this. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. That was so interesting. You did a great job. You did answer a lot of questions as you went along, so kudos to you. I just want to remind folks watching, if you have a question for Aaron, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, one of the more popular questions was, why are predators seemingly immune to CWD, and would wolves be able to spread it through their feces if they eat an infected animal?
It's a really good question. I'll answer the second part first. It's something that we're not sure of yet. One of the problems that we have in Yellowstone of determining the prevalence of chronic wasting disease in elk, for example, is the wolves or the carnivores, the magpies, the ravens, they typically don't leave anything left for us to get in there and look at the carcass and determine whether or not that elk or that deer was positive for CWD. As far as ingesting the prions and then defecating and leaving the prions on the landscape and having other deer or elk come along and become infected, that's a question that we need to look into. We don't have an answer yet. Why are carnivores immune to this specific TSE? In the same way that humans are immune to it. There's molecular barriers in the spread of certain diseases. They don't jump from one genus or one family group of the animal kingdom to another because of different biological reasons. The bioavailability between the different organisms is so different that there's not really a good matchup in transmission. That doesn't mean that could never happen. Again, with the human variations of TSE, those are not, as far as we know, transmittable to other people or to other organisms. It's a spontaneous disease that takes place in that specific species, Homo sapien. With bovines, it's, again, a really low percentage that it's ever going to leap over into humans, but it does happen. So with deer, it's just the biological makeup of deer versus carnivores versus humans. So as far as we know, the odds are extremely low. Is it possible that there could be some kind of mutation and the prion could go into carnivore populations? Yeah, there's always a chance of the abnormal. The anomaly is always a possibility in scientific observation.
And along those lines, people were wondering if rabbits or other small mammals that eat plants that were covered in prions from an infected deer, or even family pets who are out in the yard, who maybe, deer have come through that yard, would they be at risk?
They're not. Again, it's just a difference in the biological makeup and the immune makeup of each of these organisms. So chronic wasting disease specifically targets members of the deer family, which is why a lot of people can go out and consume animals that have tested positive for CWD year after year, and nothing happens to them. It's that similar situation if you have your rabbits or your dogs or your cats going out to areas where there were infected deer. It's not spilling over, but scientifically we just can never rule that possibility completely out. The odds are way, 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 way small, but we can't ever say never.
And people are really curious about bison, if they're susceptible to the bovine TSE.
That's a really good question. And there, as far as I know, there has never been a documented case of bovine spongiform infecting bison. So bison are in the bison genus, and then the cattle are in the Bos genus. They are really closely related, so closely related that they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. I've never heard of that ever taking place. I don't know. It's a good question.
And so earlier you mentioned it's probably not a good idea to feed the deer that are coming into your area. And so someone was wondering if they had bird feeders out, would that attract urban deer?
It can, unfortunately. You just need to monitor what is eating your bird seed. Depending on where you live, where I live, if I put out a bird feeder, I'm going to have black bears eating my bird seed in my bird feeder. Deer and elk and moose do the same thing. So you just have to be aware of what's in your neighborhood. If you put out bird seed for birds, and then you come out one morning and notice that your deer are eating all of your bird seed, then you should probably put your bird seed higher or figure out a way to keep those deer from coming into your yard and eating your bird seed.
And a few people are asking about this, and I know you mentioned it earlier, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about commercial producers of elk and deer meat and whether or not that's safe?
So for the slaughtering process, different states have different regulations, but the federal government, the Food and Drug Administration, have really strict regulations here in the United States and in Canada and in Scandinavia, and I'm sure they have really strict regulations in South Korea as well, where an animal that goes into a facility to be slaughtered has to be examined very closely. Any abnormalities, any post-mortem disease identification is going to immediately ex-nay that animal for mass consumption. So as far as buying elk meat or buying venison or buying bison at your local grocery store goes, I wouldn't be too concerned about CWD being in the meat that you're buying. The issue is privately owned commercial game regulations and farms are really up to individuals. So we as state wildlife management agencies make recommendations to these game farms, and we say, hey, you need to make sure that you have a fence that is high enough that you're not letting wild populations come and intermingle with your population of deer. We also have different constraints and regulations talking about how you can sell or trade your live game animals to other areas in the country, other counties or other states. But I mean, it's so difficult to detect. And again, you almost have to have a dead animal in order to test whether or not your deer or your elk was CWD positive or not, that it makes it really almost inevitable. It has been inevitable so far to have game farms selling and shipping their wildlife across the country and across the world and having the disease pop up here and there. I don't want to be overly critical of that system. That's how some people make their business. That's how they make their living. But as a system as a whole, it's definitely not conducive to stopping the spread of an alarming disease. I would like to see that practice reined in as much as possible. More regulations, I guess.
All right, well, we got a couple more questions before I call it. Someone was wondering if there are no herds with 100% involvement, it would indicate some natural immunity. Is there any evidence for that, and how to use it to slow down or eliminate the spread?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in a nutshell, are there any populations or individuals that are showing any genotypic immunity to this abnormal disease? And the answer is no. There are some individuals that have shown resilience in enduring the disease longer, if I can phrase it that way, but this disease is 100% fatal for any organism that contracts it. Some individuals just don't show signs of it for longer than others. So out of a population of 1,000 deer, you might have 1 to 5 deer that don't die within 2 years after they contracted it. They might live 5 or 6 years and then die, but they still die. And what's interesting is, as we've looked into this and people have brainstormed and said, well, why don't we just take those deer and why don't we, find what genes are working best for them and create a super deer that's immune to this. If this resilience or this delayed genotype that slows down the effects of ultimately a fatal disease, if it was evolutionarily advantageous, we would expect to see more of it. We've had this disease on the landscape since the 1960s at least, and there is still a very small amount of deer that actually show any resilience to this disease before they ultimately die. So they must have, in some way or another, they must have some kind of genotype or phenotypic abnormality that makes their sequence of genes not advantageous to be passed on. Hope I didn't make that too complicated. So there is no such thing as a deer that is immune to this disease. We haven't seen that in any species that has a TSE. But there are deer that tend to live a little bit longer before they die. Nevertheless, they're so few and far between that it doesn't show that natural selection is on our side as far as this goes.
Okay.
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to combine a couple questions for our last one here. Could this eventually wipe out entire populations or even an entire species? And could the contamination of the ground mean that entire wildlife reserves would be off limits for animals that can contract this?
Good question. So in order for a population of wildlife as fecund as deer, fecund meaning that they reproduce successfully with offspring every year or every couple of years, with deer, in order to really inhibit a population and see a decline, you have to have seroprevalence of 50% or higher. There are some small areas in the country where we have seroprevalence of chronic wasting disease where it is 50% or higher. Those are few and far between, fortunately. But in those areas, we recognize that chronic wasting disease is having a negative impact on the population as a whole. But because there's such a long incubation period, it's not like the animal gets sick and then dies in a week or two. Instead, a deer is capable within 2 years after being born, it's capable of breeding and having offspring. So this delayed, really stretched out incubation period that the disease has gives enough time for the deer population to generally be stable. It doesn't mean that the deer are healthy, so it's not like, oh, well, we're safe because as long as they can reproduce, we'll be okay. Instead, it means that, yeah, seroprevalence is not common enough for there to be negative impacts on the population, but where there are high seroprevalence populations, the deer are still able to reproduce. So will it completely wipe out a population? Probably not. But will you have a huge population of sick animals? Yeah, you could. And on wildlife refuge areas or in areas where they have fed wildlife and there is a concentration of the infected agents or prions in the ground, yeah, I mean, you can't imagine them using those areas for a long time until things have cleared up and cleaned up. It's a bizarre question. I think that we still have to wait and see what happens.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. I know there's still a lot of unanswered questions for you with this, but I appreciate you and all you're doing to research this, and I appreciate you taking the time to educate us on this subject because it's very important. I'm going to hand things back to you for closing comments.
Thank you everyone very much. Hopefully I didn't lose you in the weeds. I know that talking about disease can be fascinating, but also a little bit overwhelming and depressing. We do have an incredible amount of biodiversity here in North America with our large ungulate populations, our large cervid populations with elk, deer, moose, caribou. And I am very grateful that you all decided to tune in to this subject because unlike some of the more optimistic subjects that I'm sure you've watched here on Net have before, this one does have a little bit of a sense of doom and gloom. But it's something that we need to be aware of, and it's something that you can do your part in helping educate others about. Again, if you are a hunter, then make sure that you get your deer or your elk tested after you harvest it. If you like wildlife, then make sure that you're being involved with your state and your federal government wildlife agencies management processes to regulate feeding deer or baiting deer. Don't feed deer in your backyard. Make sure that your community isn't doing that. These are things that you can all do your part in trying to slow the spread of this disease, as again, epidemiologists and researchers are trying their hardest to come up with a solution for this disease. So Thank you all very much. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a good Friday.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate it. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We will have the lineup on our website this weekend, and also keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.